So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Jeff Rogers, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Enterprise and Employment at Brunel, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today for this very special evening to celebrate and hear the inaugural lecture of Professor Peter Thomas. So a housekeeping note, first of all, as is traditional, we're not expecting a fire alarm, so should the fire alarm sound, please leave the building and assemble outside on the grass area across the way. Janet and colleagues will point us in the correct direction if that should happen. So Professor Peter D. Thomas is a historian of political thought, historian of philosophy, and a political theorist. He has studied and worked at the University of Queensland, at the Free University in Brussels, the Università Federico II in Naples, the University of Amsterdam, and the University of Vienna. As a historian of political thought, Peter's major contributions have been in the history of Italian political thought in the early 20th century, particularly the thought of Antonio Gramsci. As a historian of philosophy, Peter has published multiple papers on the 19th and 20th century history of European philosophy. And as a political theorist, Peter's work has focused on concepts of political organization, forms of socio-political transformation, the theories of subalternity, inclusion, exclusion, and citizenship. Peter is currently working on a study of central themes in the contemporary radical political thought, including notions of the nature of politics and processes of politicization, the relationship between politics and the political, and the concept of the political subject. So I'm delighted to be taking part in this series of inaugural lectures. It celebrates the careers of Brunel's most talented and creative individuals. We have told I could move the slide on, but I don't think I'm going to manage it. Maybe I will be able to. There we are. We have the next inaugural lecture coming up on the 28th of May with Professor Simon Shaw talking about machine tools to machine learning. And then one further plug is that next, on Monday, we have the start of the Brunel Research Festival with an exciting and packed programme of events running up to the 31st of May. And I'm sure a number of you will be both contributing and attending many of those events. So I hope my introduction to Peter has whetted your appetite for his talk. And so, Peter, I invite you to give your inaugural lecture. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much to all of you coming along this evening, even if I confess I do somewhat doubt the wisdom of your choices, considering how wonderful and glorious the weather is outside. So I will do my best to not disappoint you further. Well, precisely on that topic, I think I should maybe begin by indicating that a large part of what I will be discussing tonight is precisely the theme of disappointment and disillusionment. And it seems a particularly timely topic when we discuss politics in the United Kingdom, but also on a global scale. So I've just presented for you here some images of our perhaps most recent traumas. The list could go on in the domestic sphere. We see there's some wonderful shots of a lettuce that outlasted a prime minister, of various parties that occurred when they supposedly should not have been occurring, concerns around issues of trust in politics. And although this is a theme that continually comes back over the years, the notion of a loss of trust in politics, we seem to have reached a particular low point here in the UK in recent years. Had we world enough and time, we could indeed take a tour around the globe and view the disappointment and misery occurring in other political formations. Various corruption scandals, aggressive, exclusionary, and sometimes openly fascistic movements forming governments in a variety of countries, both within Europe and beyond it, an increasing disengagement with official politics as a terrain of meaningful social improvement, and instead something like a cynical race to the bottom, a retreat from politics, a retreat not just on an individual level, but in terms of larger social collectives and their capacity to imagine politics as the opportunity to achieve their particular goals. Now, if you came here tonight disillusioned in these forms of politics, what we could call perhaps official politics, established politics, and you were hoping maybe to pick up a few reasons why you might be able to regain your trust and confidence in the political processes and institutions of the established political order, I'm afraid that, again, I have little to offer you except more disappointment and disillusionment. There seem to be, in fact, very few rational reasons why we'd wish to regain our illusions in those particular narrow types of representational politics, the types of politics that certainly may dominate media news feeds, and which are all too often mistaken for politics in a much more integral and broader sense. That is, as a much broader ranging struggle over the meanings and values that we use to communicate with each other and provide some structure to our always conflictual lives in common. Nevertheless, despite my confessed skepticism regarding the capacity of certain forms of politics, what is most often taken to be politics as such, to provide us with reasons for hope and for trust, I do believe that there are very significant reasons we have seen over many recent years to be hopeful and to trust in the capacity of certain forms of political engagement to make a positive change in the world, in the lives of our communities, and in our own lives. Why might this be? Well, in deference to what I take to be a convention or a certain autobiographical tendency in the genre of the inaugural lecture, I believe I'm now required to let you in on some secrets. I won't be showing any photos of myself in incriminating poses as a younger scholar, although they do exist and have been carefully filed away in non-digital copies for security. But I will confess that one of the reasons for my sense of hope and trust in the capacity of politics to provide a structure for the search for meaning in our common lives is precisely because I'm familiar with disappointment. In some ways, I think much of my career could be regarded as a meditation upon disappointment and failures, and indeed an attempt in some ways to embrace that disappointment as an enabling orientation, to develop an active interest in the fate of all those currents and tendencies that might today be regarded as the defeated of history, but whose defeats and the lessons that we can learn from them nevertheless seem to me to represent a distinctive form of politics that we might wish now in the winter of our discontent to revisit. Again, autobiographically, I should note that I am of a generation that, as it were, came of age at the end of the Cold War period. I distinctly remember when, in the early 1990s, as a young undergraduate, we were told stories about the end of all stories, stories about the end of history. So there we were, undergraduates, as it were, young people on the threshold of life, about to enter into history, or hoping to enter into history as intentional actors. And we were told, sorry, history is finished. It's a little bit like arriving at a party, only to be told that your arrival, in a strange way, coincides with, perhaps even causes, the drawing things to a close of the festivity. Maybe an experience with which you're familiar, certainly one that I've encountered increasingly over the years. The party had come to an end, we were told, and by no one more prominently than a particular individual who enjoyed his 5 minutes of fame in the early 1990s by the name of Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama was a particularly interesting figure involved in working for various US state apparatuses and a series of other institutions with quite a provocative writing style, and certainly one designed to attract extensive attention. Precisely at that moment, at the end of the Cold War, the declaration by the first George Bush of a new world order, Fukuyama stepped forward, as it were, as the ideologist appropriate for the moment. And he declared provocative theses about history having come to an end. And what he meant by this was, in some ways, was a technical definition of the ending of history. He was not denying that time may continue to flow and people would have their illusions or not uh, on an enduring basis, but rather the capacity for history to represent a terrain of a fundamental clash of values and the possibility of fundamental changes occurring, such as history had been before, had come to a close. He asked, are there any fundamental contradictions in human life that cannot be resolved in the context of modern liberalism, that would be resolved by an alternative political economic structure? The more you think about this formulation, the more I think you can come to appreciate that undoubtedly Fukuyama was a lackey for the established order, or as we used to say in happier days, a running dog for imperialism. But not all running dogs of imperialism are necessarily as interesting in their perspectives as he were. The questions that he was posing in the early 1990s, I think, were you to pose them today for many participants in official political processes, the answers would, for many, remain unchanged. We think in particular of a convergence by major political formations in this country around the acceptance of various market relations as inevitable for the organization and function of society. I think you see the type of consensus that Fukuyama was exploring remains firmly lodged in many political actors' minds. Fukuyama, however, was not simply an apologist for the established order, and I think this was sometimes missed by some of his left-wing critics, because despite him being a team player and celebrating the victory of his team, these celebrations were also tinged in his case by a deeper historical awareness and even what he would call a type of sadness at the history he claimed to have come to an end. He went on to note, the end of history, as he envisaged it, will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In the post-historical period, there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. I think in reading these lines, and in particular reflecting upon what modern politics had been, the possibility for daring, for courage, imagination, and idealism, and the sadness Fukuyama noted when he surveyed a world when these qualities would become less available to political actors and indeed to populations as a whole, we see a very interesting self-critical reflex in his nevertheless celebratory praise of the New World Order inaugurated in those years. The notion that some fundamental change in our societies is not possible, that merely technical fixes, regulation, the administration of things as the horizon of political activity that Fukuyama discussed, while increasingly contested, remains, I think, one of the fundamental orientating dimensions of the way our society's political lives function, and perhaps I would suggest one of the fundamental reasons that we continue to go through recurrent crises and declarations of failing trust and confidence in political processes, precisely because of the type of politics that has come to represent the only alternative form of politics for so many. Hopelessness can only be countered by what is necessarily the always irrational cultivation of hope. As a young student, I think looking back, my generation of students responded in different ways with a declaration something along these lines. Well, if history really is over, as we've been told, we might as well spend our time trying to find out what happened while it was still a going concern. And thus began for many of us something like an odyssey of endless reading, of reading groups and debates, exploring the great texts and classics of political theory and political philosophy, trying to make sense of them, yes, but also, I think, somehow trying to recover between their lines something of the intensity of political passion that had existed in the past and that we'd been told was to be denied to us as seemingly post-historical latecomers. I know of no better graphic depiction of the type of humble scholarly practice in which we're engaged than some lines that were written by Machiavelli, the great outcast prophet, defeated but not destroyed. Machiavelli will be known to many of you as certainly a great writer, a great political theorist, and political philosopher. And I'm sure, as many of you also know, Machiavelli's political theory and philosophy was also born from a certain experience of disappointment. Long before he became world famous, as in some ways the inaugurator of modern political science, Machiavelli himself was an intensely active politician. And it was the defeat of his immediate political objectives and projects that, in fact, enabled him to develop into the great theorist as we remember him today. After his defeat in the factional politics of Florence, Machiavelli was rusticated, a wonderful word we don't use enough in contemporary political discussions. We should bring it back. Rustication. He was sent to the countryside and found himself living amongst decidedly unpolitical, for those times, unlearned peasants in a farming community in San Casciano. Today, not much more really than somewhere on the edges of the suburbs of Florence, but then in the deep, dark Tuscan countryside. And there are some fascinating descriptions of how Machiavelli passed his day from being a statesman accustomed to consorting with all the great diplomats and politicians of Europe, spent his day consorting with quite humble, unlearned people in the countryside, getting muddy and dirty, rolling around with pigs and so forth. And then finally, in the evening, returning, as it were, to his natural vocation. You can see there a wonderful image, the statue that stands in the Uffizi in Florence of Machiavelli. Is a gallery of statues celebrating many famous figures from Florentine history. He wrote in a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori these wonderful lines, an incredibly graphic image about the transformation that would occur as he stepped back from his rusticated lifestyle and tried to remember who he really was, to recover those passions that had been denied to him. I return home, he wrote, and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions. And they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time, I absorb myself into them completely. Just to take a short detour, I can't really imagine a more wonderful description of the passion of the scholar and the experience of absorbing yourself completely into another's world, into the great works, whether that's a work of political theory or literature or a complex mathematical theory. The image here of the scholar completely immersed in this world and conversing with their masters, so to speak, is a precious one. I think one that will be reflected in many of your experiences here in the university. What's significant for me in this image with Machiavelli is also the fact that he was not merely referring here to some sort of imaginary conversations he might have been having with long dead people. It was not for Machiavelli some type of refuge or flight from the present. Remember, Machiavelli had already been rusticated, rejected by the current politics in the Florence of his time. On the contrary, Machiavelli's practice, you could even call it his ritual of reading, note the donning of the robes he undertakes as he begins these journeys each night, was for him a struggle to remain actual, to be present to his own current moment in ways that had been denied to him. Machiavelli's very graphic image, therefore, presents to us what I think is the truth of the very pregnant saying of another great Italian philosopher, Benedetto Croce, from the early 20th century, who claimed, in a phrase I think we can reflect upon until the cows come home, that history is always contemporary history. And by this, Croce is not merely referring to the notion that the histories that are written today will inevitably reflect various interests that tell us much about the interests of the present, or at least as much about the interests of the present as they may do about the past. More fundamentally, I think Croce here is pointing to the notion of history itself as an intervention into the present. The process of narrativization of a supposedly now past situation is itself a concrete act that helps to establish the present as itself. It writes and describes the past that it deserves. This process is nowhere more so than in any other field of historical inquiry, I think, than in the field of the history of political thought, where the political context that is studied and the way in which is studied is inevitably also always a political act, an intervention into the present that seeks to restructure and restructure the possible concepts with which we can understand politics, even when this is simply the construction or the recovery of a past in a way that may be more comprehensible to us in the present, or the translation of previous concerns into the idioms we now speak. This is to say that if the study of the history of political thought is indeed necessarily a study of concepts, of languages and discourses from previous political moments on their own terms, the attempt to recover them in some way, to know them as accurately as historical method will enable us to. It is also then a political act. And ultimately, we engage in these acts of the recovery of resources from previous moments of political intensity, not simply in order to know those past moments, but to know them as our own, and thereby to increase our understanding of the nature of politics as it presents itself to us in our own present. That is, the history of political thought practiced in a certain way becomes an attempt to understand more and therefore to act more effectively in contemporary politics as well. Previous political conceptualities and languages here certainly can be regarded as sources of inspiration, but also as in some ways reflections in which the refractions of the past can help us to see in different ways the types of images the present attempts to provide us with. I'd like to provide you with an illustration of how this approach from the history of political thought, or the history of political thought practice in this way, might be able to work in relation to significant contemporary political issues, and particularly the themes I began discussing, the experience of disappointment or loss of trust or confidence in the capacity of politics to constitute a meaningful terrain of engagement. And I'll do so by turning to another very significant moment from the history of political thought, and a thinker who in some ways inaugurates much of the modern tradition that attempts to think the presence of the past in the present. We have there a rather young Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and an excerpt from his Phenomenology of Spirit, one of the most astonishing philosophical works ever written. There are various apocryphal legends around it. One legend has it that when he had completed writing this long work that narrated the journeys of world spirit all the way from the ancient world to political modernity, he stepped outside his study in Jena, in Germany, at the precise moment when Napoleon's armies had won the famous Battle of Jena. So there was a legend that circulated saying that Hegel declared Napoleon to be world spirit on horseback. Most probably that particular legend is not true, but nevertheless an intriguing one, that one of the great political figures who remade political modernity in Napoleon may have come within the visual angle of one of the great thinkers of political modernity in the figure of Hegel. Most probably more accurate is another legend surrounding the work of Phenomenology of Spirit, which was written in a marathon sprint of 9 months after Hegel, who was then an underemployed young tutor, was informed by his then girlfriend that in 9 months time or so, he would have other significant responsibilities to think about. So it might be time for him to get on and finish that dissertation and finally get a proper job. It was certainly the type of work that seemed to have been written with a frenetic energy. This work is particularly fascinating because of the context in which Hegel was working, and in many ways we remember him now as one of the great prophets of political modernity as such. He was writing in the midst of a period that had witnessed some of the great events that continue to mark us today. A global revolution against slavery. This is the period when the only great successful slave revolt on the island of Haiti occurs and leads to the foundation of an independent nation state. In the Germany of the time, it's the final dissolution of the old feudal order, with the almost symbolic coming to an end of the Holy Roman Empire at the feet of Napoleon's invading armies. It's the period when various figures throughout the French revolutionary process have been advocating or vindicating the rights of women, and so many other themes that today seem to us to have become a fundamental part of the grammar of modern politics. All of these types of themes are circulating in Hegel's days, and in many respects, his work is an attempted synthesis of all of their powers and potentialities. It was indeed a heroic age, the type of heroic age, perhaps, of which Fukuyama was thinking when he told us in the early 1990s what was to be denied to us. My argument, however, is that read in a certain way, these ideas of Hegel might help us to shift our perspective, to see in some ways how his words may speak not only to his own time, but could also be asked to dialogue with the immense political transformations of our own times. What do I mean by the immense political transformations of our own times? I think we need to remember, despite the stories that are so often told to us at bedtime, that the early years of the 21st century have astonishingly witnessed wave after wave of a variety of protests and rebellions against the New World Order that it was proclaimed in the early 1990s, protests and rebellions that have gone all around the globe. And here I'd point out perhaps simply some of them that have punctuated politics over the last 30 years to try and give you some sense of the reach of these movements. The image you'll see up on that side of the slide, a particularly important one to me again, to once again indulge the autobiographical dimension, an image of Subcomandante Marcos from the Zapatistas, whose rebellion against a whole range of issues in the Mexican state and internationally was seen as a clarion call around the world in the early 1990s. We could pass through and think about the alternative globalization movement straddling the turn of the new century, the battle in Seattle, as it was known. We could think about the incredible wave of anti-war protests throughout the first decade and the various movements against the so-called war on terror. Anti-war mobilizations that at their peak were quantitatively larger than any of the mobilizations that had occurred, for instance, against the Algerian occupation by France or against the Vietnam War in its various instances. We could think also significantly about the so-called pink tide in Latin America as a whole series of countries experimented with what came to be known as a type of socialism for the 21st century. We could think about the opportunities opened up by Occupy, first in New York and spreading globally to instigate new conceptions of a public sphere. Very significantly, the revolutionary upsurges that came to be known, I think, somewhat inaccurately as the Arab Spring, and whose contested legacy is still unfolding today. Various anti-austerity campaigns over the last 10 to 15 years. Black Lives Matters movements and other anti-racist movements that have been increasing in intensity over the last 10 years. The International Women's Strike and its focus upon issues of social reproduction as a point of mobilization and their intersection with various other anti-sexist movements, Me Too, and so forth. The acceleration of climate justice movements around the globe and different techniques of direct action, and most recently, confluence around various anti-apartheid measures in Palestine. All of these movements, I think, and the continuity of them, their persistence, and the way in which one movement has rolled over or translated itself over into others over a long cycle of cycles, over 30 years, I think are historically significant. We could certainly respond to Fukuyama now on the basis of empirical evidence, despite his claim that history had come to an end, in the sense of the end of any meaningful clash of values between civilizational models. They do indeed seem continually to have re-emerged, and most interestingly, have proliferated in their continual dialogue between each other. Sometimes these various radical emancipatory movements have been punctual and sometimes delayed. Sometimes they've been ephemeral, emerging for a very short season and seemingly dying away, but then somehow also seemingly subterranean, burrowing away and waiting along for the next upsurge or movement to come along, where themes that had previously been explored re-emerge in new contexts. If we view all of these cycle of struggles from the 1990s to today over a longer generational perspective, there is not just one particular movement or one single issue, but their interrelationships over time and the way actors have moved between different movements and have learned from different experiences. I think we can see that the new century has been characterized by a progressive accumulation of increasingly accelerated political cycles on a variety of terrains and in very different geopolitical regions. It's almost as if political energies have been exhausted in one area, and in some ways return to the earth, some type of mythic figure, in order to re-emerge or rise somewhere else, gathering strength from a moment of rest in order to relaunch campaigns on a different front. Now, obviously, as an intelligent skeptic would point out to me quite immediately, it is true these movements of resistance, rebellion, and protest and revolt may not have issued in what can be regarded as unambiguous victories. Whole-scale regime change seems to have been quite slight, if at all. Often the failures of these movements haven't even necessarily been of particularly significant types, more a petering away than going out with a bang. And whatever modest successes they have enjoyed, the mobilization of more human beings than ever before in human history against the use of war as a mechanism for resolving disputes between human communities is not exactly a modest success, and one not to be discounted. Whatever the significance of these successes they may have enjoyed in their own moments, Sometimes we are told that when we measure them against standards derived from previous cycles of radical politics, say the mythical 1960s or 1970s, they are continually found to be wanting. And indeed, it's been a recurrent theme over the last 30 years that at the beginning of the upsurge of these cycles, its struggles, it hasn't been difficult to hear voices that have been hopefully declaring the end of a long season of defeats. And equally, it has not been difficult to hear the more skeptical note deflating such enthusiasms. And sometimes it may seem, in fact, that these recurrent uprisings followed by defeats may lead into the precise opposite of a virtuous circle, spiraling down into vice, particularly when various xenophobic, racist, and national mobilizations or revivals from the far right, such as of late, have been able to fill the vacuum that have been left by the defeat or demobilization of emancipatory projects. And we can look through a whole range of instances where this is the case, that moments of hope have been followed quite rapidly by moments of disappointment. Cast your mind back to the spectacular, seemingly for many almost spontaneous, eruption of revolutionary initiatives across the Arab world in the so-called Arab Spring, and then their subsequent fierce repression. We can think about the very brief season when there was so much excitement about the encampments in New York that came together under the banner of Occupy and then spread seemingly rapidly around the globe, springing up in all sorts of unexpected places, and then their equally rapid dispersion in both a figurative and a literal sense. We can think also of the process in Latin America, where a whole series of hopes on a global scale invested in the possibility of an alternative path of development seemingly came crashing up against the limits of the attempts to regulate what remained fundamentally capitalist economies by means of political intervention. In each of these cases, in each of these cycles, initial enthusiasms more or less gradually subsided when they were not abandoned, as those different movements and their domestic and international supporters confronted the sober realities and contradictions of what remains the established political order on a civilizational scale. In a similar fashion, if we look closer to home, a whole range of processes have occurred for European movements of protest and rebellion, and a gradual migration around the continent, as it were, as European forces invest their hopes in various areas. At the time of the alternative globalization movement, Italy seemed a particularly promising example of a movement of movements, new forms of coordination. Later on, in the wake of the movements against the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, breakthroughs in Germany seemed particularly promising. For a season, France seemed the possibility for a new configuration of different oppositional political forces into a new type of united front. And then for a brief season around 10 years ago, Greece showed one opportunity to challenge the path of the European Union descending into a regulatory form of developmentalism. Moving on to Podemos's attempt to traverse the contradictions of a disintegrating Spanish nation state, or even then reflecting upon the various enthusiasms and hopes that were invested in Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party or in the various presidential bids of Bernie Sanders in the USA. A series of cycles in which hopes that have been both domestic and international have translated around the globe and constituted focal points for energy and activity. And then we reflect, after all of these long cycles of mobilizations and protests and wondering what becomes of them, we reflect then that this entire cumulative cycle seemingly has been sent in reverse by the revival of the extreme right across the continent and around the globe in terms which are not entirely incompatible with the dynamics of the 1930s. And let us perhaps never forget that Europe currently has governments in power that have direct and explicit links back to the fascist parties of that earlier period. before we launch into condemnation of various fascistic movements that have emerged in other areas of the world equally in these periods. Whatever temporary setbacks these movements have suffered, and how much, perhaps in recent years, perhaps post-Brexit, these reactionary currents seem to have grown in strength in particular national contexts, I would suggest that at least this is clear if we consider not just the local situation, but the global situation over the longer extended generational period that runs from the 1990s until today. Something fundamental has shifted in the type of exhausted end of history structures of feeling and response that were dominated by the experiences of defeat for emancipatory and popular politics in the final phases of the 20th century. The type of melancholia that obsessed so many involved in emancipatory politics no longer exerts the same mesmerizing fascination that it did throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the years of the post, as it were. For those who have been active in the movements and mobilizations of the oppositional political cultures of the last decade, for example, that type of orientation of obsessing almost narcissistically over the defeats of the past seems something more than dated. For these much younger standpoints, there are problems to be solved. There are immediate legacies and residues of colonialism, of racist discrimination, and most prominently of all, the immediate pressing urgency of the climate crisis. The present no longer appears as some type of pale reflection or repetition formalistically of the past, but instead it's populated by new types of figures and new opportunities. This novelty derives in the first instance from changed conditions of contemporary politics, which I think on a global scale is characterized by a unique conjugation of crises on multiple fronts. We have on the one hand continuing expansive capitalist globalization in an increasingly unipolar world that's accompanied by increasing imperialist interventionism around the globe of different imperialisms, an accelerating environmental catastrophe on what is increasingly becoming apparent is an absolutely apocalyptic scale, which coincides then at the same time with the ongoing attempted pulverization of autonomous institutions of popular industrial and political organization. The redefinition of the sites of injustice and its contestation occurring alongside technical reconfigurations of social space and time. The distinctiveness of this period, I think, when we view this long generational dynamic, also owes something to the way in which contemporary movements have attempted to confront these interlinking challenges as discrete instances of protest, which are nevertheless in some ways linked together in their revolt against everything that appears to be the contemporary world itself. Emancipatory politics in the early decades of the 21st century has witnessed this series of cycles of struggles with demands and tactics and energies from one particular movement spilling over into others. This cross-fertilization of perspectives and orientations has, I think, been intensified and accelerated in what can be regarded as the intersectional socio-political movements of the last decade, with their convergence or assembling of instances of struggles against discrimination based on class, race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, and so forth. Perhaps the most prominent example of this in the depths of the pandemic, the energies that emerged around the Black Lives Matters movement and its continuing translation on a global scale into the current struggle against global apartheid, and the way in which a movement beginning against police brutality in the United States finds forms of translation into legal depositions by sovereign African nation states in international courts regarding the status of apartheid in Palestine. Viewed from a certain visual angle, the convergence in what is, after all, may seem like a big chunk of our lives, but it is, after all, in the historical scheme of things, quite a short period of time. The convergence of all these movements against gendered and sexualized violence, racialization, climate change, repression of trade union organization, state-led exacerbation of a global pandemic, and apartheid in all of its forms in the global north and global south, end up forming something like a generational collage of denunciations, not of any particular wrong, but of the multi-faced forms of injustice itself. Albeit unevenly, failingly, and recommencingly, in turn, sometimes frustratingly patient, our times are marked, I think, by a revival of popular struggles and experimentation in new political practices on a scale that we have not witnessed since the long 1960s. The movements over the last 30 years, whatever blockages and setbacks, and be frank, defeats they have all encountered, should be viewed nevertheless in their totality as a type of learning process in the challenges of what it would take to develop a genuinely emancipatory politics for today. A renewal of politics as a struggle over the fundamental values of people's living together rather than the technocratic administration of persons reduced to things. These movements have begun to articulate a new vocabulary of radical political action based upon what is now becoming increasingly an intergenerational structure of feeling and modes of response to the diverse processes of domination, exploitation, subalternization that continue to structure our civilization of a global scale. But crucially and equally, they have become forms of feeling and response of solidarity between those diverse struggles themselves. The ongoing learning processes of new forms of response to the manifold crises that beset our civilizations and the capacity of popular political mobilization to confront them and propose innovative solutions to them. It's this persistence, endurance, the repetition, the learning and translation and retranslation of these moments of active alternatives can, I think, give us some sense of hope and trust in the proposition that perhaps history isn't quite over yet and that the prize of remaking the world still lies there to be won. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was absolutely fascinating. I thought right at the very end, actually quite positive, despite your claim at the beginning that you were going to be positive. We've got about 10, 15 minutes left. Anybody like to start? If you just wait for the microphone, then people online can hear you as well.
Thank you, Peter Thomas, for a very enlightening talk on the topic. On a related subject, I had a question in my mind, though you have already shed some light on that, on the efficacy of protests, specifically in the 21st century. Do you think so that repeatedly we tend to see that public protests, even if they are very massive level protests, they have resulted almost in nothing or in futility, at least at the government level. So they have this impact on, like, in sort of like educating the masses about certain issues. But if we look at the state responses, we have seen that actually states have uh, been using perhaps disproportionate force to crush those protests or to somehow quell or to suppress those protests. So my question basically is that, since you have definitely would have like looked into details about the efficacy of modern protests, specifically in the Western societies, we have seen that protests somehow have resulted in change of even governments in, for example, in the Arab Spring, although that was a bit counterproductive. For example, in the Egyptian case, we have seen that Egypt have moved from one military dictatorship to another military dictatorship through the Arab Spring. But uh, if we look at the Western states, what is your idea about the efficacy of modern protests, specifically in the 21st century?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's obviously always a difficult thing to try and measure the success of any particular political movement, particularly when it's a political movement that's decided to step outside the accepted bounds and the established institutions in which politics normally occurs in any given society. So if we set the bar quite high and we insist that unless a particular protest movement topples a government or introduces regime change, it has failed, according to that criterion, we'd find very few political movements in world history that are able. So if you mean by demands that have been met, have been government policies instituted that in some ways accommodate them, the type of language I'm using there might indicate then the limits. If a protest movement wishes to be accommodated by established political structures, and finds a way for that to be done, that may be regarded as a type of success. But as is always the case, there will be others involved in that movement who perhaps thought of more radical or innovative solutions, who are looking for changes in political structures or other ways in which those demands could be met. So it depends the level at which the bar is set. I think really significantly, and what I was trying to emphasize, that if we look in terms of the learning about political action and the potential for political action that has been going on over the last 30 years, there are very significant gains in many directions. So I'd highlight one theme in particular. One theme that has absolutely innovated the terrain of political action in all directions, but particularly in movements that will think of themselves as in some ways left wing, is a consciousness and awareness of issues related to racial discrimination, gender discrimination, the nature of gender relations and structures, social reproduction, have entered into political discourses in ways that we cast our minds back 40 or 50 years were almost unthinkable. Now, these may seem like small things under the radar, so to speak, but the fact that they've set an agenda and forced established forms of politics to adjust in different ways to those demands has certainly, on a mass level, a very significant impact. More generally, it's also interesting for me that these protest movements, if we measure them by criterion of the amount of learning that goes on, the new communities of activists and political actors that are developed from those areas, there we see as well the translation between different moments of protest and cycles as they have developed. And I think that's been particularly the case when you refer to the West. If we look at Western Europe specifically, particularly the case in the revival of a new generation of public and civic engagement in ways that's very different from the types of modes of response and depoliticization that was occurring in the 1980s and 1990s. So there's very much more a sense of the capacity to engage in certain types of political action as a meaningful way for people to navigate their way through life.
Right. So that was a very good question and a great answer. Now we're going to be a little bit quicker in the next few, and then there'll be time for conversation outside. I don't know why they succinct questions, and Peter will summarise his answer.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your fascinating talk. Hadn't realised that it was possible to see rustication in Tuscany as a punishment rather than a reward. But my question anyway is: so just like you to compare for a moment the last 20 years, well, 20, 30 years since the Zapatistas. What you're describing there represents a whole set of social movements whereby millions of social movement activists around the world and people sort of in their penumbra, so to speak, begin to develop a sense of anti-systemic consciousness because of the intersectionality, or going beyond that, the coalescence of these topics of, you know, the Me Too movement, a global women's movement, the Black Lives Matter, climate justice, and so on. All of these things connect in a lot of people's minds to develop a sense of anti-systemic critical consciousness. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, you had something similar in one respect, that anti-systemic critical consciousness around another peace movement, against the Vietnam War, around the civil rights movement, early, you know, feminist movements and movements against homophobia and so on. Again, this coalescence. But back then, there was a much stronger sense that something, you know, that progress could be pushed through by mass struggles. Much stronger sense than in the movements that you represent here. And so there was the radicalism of that period contrasted to the more diffuse sense, let's say, today. What, in your analysis, is the heart of that, lies at the heart of that difference? What's the nub of the issue there that defines that contrast between those two periods, 60s, 70s, contrasted to the last 10, 20 years?
I think the key to that is us shifting our expectations, because when you look back at the historical record, you see the type of anti-systemic consciousness you're talking about will emerge out of a long process of mobilization around the Vietnam War, around what become known as civil rights and so forth in the United States and other issues in other countries around the world. But it's much longer than a decade of different struggles and political cultures talking to each other before that confluence, as it were, starts to come together. Before that, it's much more fragmentary. It's not so dissimilar from the type of situations we may have been living through, but the gradual accumulation of different experiences and the capacity for them to engage in meaningful forms of action alongside each other against this monolith of a war that seems it will never end and is posing a direct threat to the lives of so many in the global north and global south, gives that moment of extension, as it were, that enables all of that confluence to come together on a mass scale. Now, it's not quite so clear to me that our period is qualitatively different from that, and based upon the types of things that have been happening and the processes of learning across different movements. It would seem to me there's a rational basis to hope that a similar type of confluence is a prize to be won also today. And I just note again, as we move through from Black Lives Matter, through responses to the pandemic, intersections, the struggles around climate justice, and today, all the anti-war mobilizations going on, and seeing the configuration of that terrain, I would pose the question, are we really today so much less radical than they were in the early 60s? Is that type of dynamic one that may be occurring, if not in the same forms, that at least in ways that may rhyme with it? We should be open to that possibility.
Just the Fukuyama argument and saying that the future would be about more managerial responses and technical responses to crises. If you look at the response to the climate crisis, which you could argue is the biggest crisis to confront humanity for however long you care to go back, the response to that has been very technical and managerial in carbon accounting and the way in which we manage things in value of nature. It hasn't been radical. So, I mean, could you argue that the way in which
I guess I would respond by saying, and look how far it's got us, because just today the figures come out of basically we're all going to fry much sooner than we thought we were, because that technical response simply has not been up to the task. Fundamentally, to address the climate crisis, we need a massive political project to revisit what our civilizational priorities are. And I don't see, in a technical sense, any way around that unless the human species revisits its conception of consumption. That's the hard reality. We will have to have the political discussions around that. And the attempted technical tinkering with that, all these innovations are wonderful and welcome and so forth, but it will not be enough to resolve the problem we have in front of us. And precisely for that reason, if history came at least to a pause, perhaps, we definitely need to get it going again pretty quickly, or it won't just be history that comes to an end. It'll be life on the planet as we know it, in the short and not the medium term.
I kind of wanted to respond to what this gentleman over here said. I think we have to be kinder to ourselves because Machiavelli got the opportunity to rusticate. I mean, yeah, they did torture him beforehand, but he was allowed to live to tell the tale. There's a lot of people that have experienced, have lived through revolution, that have committed revolutionary acts that are not here to tell the tale. For some people, just being alive long enough to continue to the next generation is in itself a revolutionary act. Also, we know that protest works, and the government knows that protests work, and that's why they've systematically criminalized protests since the poll tax riots. Protest really works, but we don't get to see it because the media is so controlled. Look at France last summer; that looked like a very successful protest to me. I'm pretty sure that they didn't reduce the pension age in the end. So there are protests, there are victories, but we live in an age where the media does not show us the victories. And to an extent as well, the leaders that were available in the 60s were largely decimated, largely disappeared into the criminal justice system. So to an extent, we've had to grow new leaders. But I think we can take hope in what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I think there's hope.
One more question. No? Okay, all right. In that case, Peter, would you like to just comment on that last point?
I just highlight failure is inbuilt into the scientific process. Yeah? It's one of the great things about modern science. It valorizes failure and the possibility of understanding that we learn something from that experience. Politics is also a process of experimentation, and you need to try out different things. So when we approach politics today, we can either decide, yep, humanity worked out the best way to organize its political life in a representative system with a circulation of political elites, and we can be done with it and leave it there. Or we could think, well, this is one of our steps along the way to understanding what the great promise of political modernity was, with the whole notion of human freedom, this radically new concept we discovered just a few centuries ago. And maybe that's something we need to continue experimenting with. I'd suggest that the sorts of movements I've been talking about, they represent an important part of that ongoing experimentation. And if they fail along the way, all the better. We learn which hypotheses didn't work, and we can continue to develop that discussion along the path of reinvigorating a genuine conception of history as